Good morning. Welcome to the Graduate Institute. We're very happy to see you here for this launch event of the GFinder. And you will have seen the program, which of course we've changed and adapted, as always happens. So we will start the morning with opening remarks by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who's the Deputy Director General at the World Health Organization and brings a long-standing experience in research and science also to that position. But also because, of course, when you go to WHO, you sort of lose your national identity. But I'm sure she was thrilled when she saw this report and saw the results for India, for example, and them moving so strongly and rapidly, actually, into this space. And this, as we will hear, is a really important key message in terms of funding that we will hear from this GFinder report. You will see that in general it's an optimistic report with good news, but there are some problems, and we'll also hear about them, and many of those problems actually are related still to a group of the neglected tropical diseases, and that needs to be picked up. We hope also that we'll be able to take up some of these themes in terms of research, innovation, product development, but then also really issues of delivery. And if any of you were able to watch the global health financing discussion at the WEF yesterday, it's still on the web, you can watch it with all the big guys talking about financing. But the key message there, again, was how do we improve delivery? So we have products, we have innovation, but we need to get this to the people. And in some areas, of course, the context also, particularly for that, in quotes, last group of people, is getting ever more difficult in terms of civil strife, extreme forms of poverty, but then also, you know, some of these really, really intractable problems. Peter Sands from the Global Fund alluded to it again, that as long as we don't resolve the gender issue, we are not going to resolve many of these disease challenges that we have. So a scope of issues that we will discuss. We've got a fantastic panel that I will introduce afterwards. They will make some short opening statements. I will ask them some questions. Then we hand over to you. You can ask questions or add something to the debate. Just please don't hold an additional presentation. That would be much appreciated. And then there'll be some closing remarks from my side. Of course, you will be introduced to the report itself after Soumya speaks. And so we will have a good base on which to have a discussion. So it's my great pleasure now to hand over to Soumya. Please, Soumya, come into this corner.
Thank you very much, Ilona, and good afternoon to all of you. As Ilona introduced, I'm the Deputy Director General for Programs at the World Health Organization with Dr. Tedros. And my own background is as a researcher. So essentially, I've been a clinical researcher in TB primarily and TB HIV, though I'm a pediatrician by training. And then went on to head the Indian Council of Medical Research and was closely involved with public health policy making and practice, and this whole issue of how do you get policymakers to take on board the findings of research and the evidence, but also how to engage with researchers. So they're often two different communities. So the policymakers and the researchers are often in academic institutions doing their own research, and once in a while when they meet, they're not on the same page, because researchers think that it's absolutely self-evident what the findings from the research are showing, that this is the way in which we should be going. But for the policymakers, they have a whole different set of priorities and questions, which perhaps the researchers haven't even thought about. And this became very clear to me when, my interactions with the health ministry in India, but also in many other countries, that it's not just the scientific evidence that underpins policy making. It's, of course, politics. A lot of it is the priorities of the government, but it's also looking at things from a very different point of view. And one thing I must say that coming to WHO has highlighted also is that we must always continue to focus on people and the populations that we're trying to do this for. So not research for the sake of research, but where is it going to end up? And can we actually see that pathway through? And what are all the different steps that will be needed? And I think in the past, perhaps we haven't done it as well, because we've often been in a situation where you have a product that's sitting on the shelf of a company, but you haven't done, or the company hasn't done, or others haven't done the required amount of field testing or research that's needed to actually move that into practice. So we've seen many examples where you have a product, but there's no guideline or policy recommendation, or you have a product that has a policy recommendation but has not been pre-qualified, and so countries don't have access to it, and so on. So I think we need to really think very holistically, and I will say a few things about neglected disease research and development, and how I see us really approaching that in the future, with a view, of course, to the elimination or at least the control of these neglected diseases. And in the travels that I've done last year, it was very clear that some of the most neglected diseases are still not getting enough attention. I think Ilona referred to that. So while it's very encouraging to see the results of this report showing an overall increase in R&D funding, but 2/3 of that is still going to the big three. And in fact, some areas have actually seen decreases in funding, and I believe trachoma is an example where there's actually been a reduction of funding. It's a very small amount, $2 million, and it went really towards vaccine development, which would eventually help the urogenital form of the disease, but not the conjunctival trachoma, which is what the eye form of the disease, which is what causes immense amount of suffering and unnecessary blindness, painful blindness in a lot of people. So $2 million in trachoma going towards vaccine, I mean, that's not a very good story. So there are others. I went to Sudan, and I went to the Mycetoma Research Center, and I was, shocked, impressed, whatever, by the complete lack of scientific knowledge we have about mycetoma. In this day and age, we still don't know what are the pathogens that cause it, how to diagnose it early enough, what's the best treatment strategy for it. And so what ends up happening is, and it affects the most marginalized, the poorest, and the most vulnerable. Outside the sight of everybody, they're in these remote villages in Sudan and Ethiopia and that part of the world. And they have to travel hundreds of miles to even access basic services. And I'm sure you're going to mention that the trial that you're doing, the DNDi is doing, to look at better treatment options. But it's really very difficult. Even in WHO, we don't have that focus on, and we can't do everything for everybody. But I think there's also a question of equity. And so one of the suggestions that I was going to make is, while the report looks at funding for R&Ds in terms of the disease burden, which is absolutely logical, and tries to assess how much is going to the major diseases, but there are also, I think, issues perhaps of equity, perhaps diseases which may not cause a huge burden in terms of numbers, but because they affect the most marginalized people in society, there should be a special lens. You mentioned gender, Ilona, that's very true, but there's also the other forms of inequity, and it would be really good to put a spotlight on how much, trachoma is also a good example, how much funding is going towards those diseases, because otherwise we won't be true to the SDG goals of leaving no one behind. You might make tremendous progress, for example, in HIV or malaria, and that's true. It affects millions of people. And at the same time still have these populations that remain neglected with very little attention being paid to them. And it does need R&D. It's not just the implementation focus, but we do need new tools. There is a difference, of course, between the neglected diseases definition of this report and what the neglected tropical disease list is. As per WHO, there are lots of overlaps, but it also excludes some of the NTDs like guinea worm, snake bite, rabies, and scabies. Yeah. Now, helminths is another area where we've seen an increase in funding, so that's very encouraging to note. And it is good that there's a focus on new drug development for helminths, because we're still quite reliant on the old drugs, and having new drugs. And of course, this year we've had some great success stories as well. We've had the moxidectin for onco. We've had fexnidazole for sleeping sickness. We've had a couple of new vaccines being pre-qualified, typhoid, rotavirus, etc. So there has been tremendous progress, but we need to again highlight the fact that, for example, helminths, which affect a huge number of people worldwide, we still need to continue to work on new drugs, and I know that people are working on vaccines as well, but also on diagnostics, because very often the problem in many of these diseases is having a point of care or easy to do an affordable diagnostic test that's available. I think mycetoma, that's one of the issues. There's no way of really diagnosing it. You have to do a biopsy, which means you need surgical facilities, you need a pathologist, and so on. So and we've seen tremendous progress being made in diseases where a rapid diagnostic test has become available. So I think a focus also on investments into diagnostics and trying to move that field forward will be very good. I'm of course delighted to see that India is now amongst the top 4 in terms of investments, but also other middle-income countries stepping up their investments. And while I was at the ICMR, we created a TB research consortium, really to bring the focus on TB, but also to have a sort of a consortium or partnership of government funders, but including other partners, international agencies, PDPs, private sector, as well as civil society, in trying to identify the top research priorities and trying to bring together these different partners, sometimes who are doing very disparate things, onto the same page, saying, can we agree on what are the top priorities that we should be focusing on? But because there's always limited pot of money available. And rather than dispersing it into hundreds of small projects, could we identify a few key areas where India could actually contribute if we focused on that? And I think that has yielded a lot of dividends. And that the first example that I can tell you is, I think for the first time, we will see globally a TB vaccine trial where 2 different vaccines, innovative vaccines, will be tested head-to-head within the same trial. So we've never actually seen that kind of thing happening, where the different companies have actually come on the same page, developed a protocol together with a public-funded R&D organization like the ICMR that takes responsibility for the trial. And ideally, we would want even more arms we could have, because it's a very efficient way of doing trials. When you have multiple new products for a disease, doing a head-to-head comparison, you can get the answer in one trial rather than doing several trials one after the other. So that was a good example of how we were able to convene, because again of the convening power and the trust in the body that's bringing people together, different private sector companies with very different interests and portfolios, but agreeing to collaborate on a vaccine trial. So now I'm told that there were 4 or 5 trials that we had prioritized at that time, and for TB, and a lot of them with international partnerships, and also there's the development in TB, which is very encouraging, which is a BRICS R&D network, where the BRICS countries actually came together and said, we need to do more for TB and need to invest more in research on TB. And there's a very good dialogue between Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia on what are the priorities where they could actually collaborate. And new diagnostics as well as vaccines are both priorities for that group. Now, it's complex when you have 4 or 5 governments with their own rules and regulations, trying to agree on something common. But I think, again, we have a good model where they could have a common protocol, but each country could then fund the research within their own boundaries. So there's no dollars crossing national boundaries, but at the same time, you have a common protocol, you have a common understanding. And I see WHO playing an important convening role in such dialogues in the future. I think we should be at the center of it, particularly in neglected disease R&D, play a convening role, bring people together. I agree on the top priorities and also agree on the pathway. So the last point I'd probably like to make is on the pathway. And as I said at the beginning, there are guidelines for, there are steps which has to be followed for a product to get into WHO guidelines. So there has to be a certain amount of evidence, ideally from RCTs, but otherwise from observational studies. Then there are the systematic reviews done that then goes into a grade process. I mean, I'm talking about clinical guidelines. Of course, there are then the public health guidelines and strategies that are also developed. But one of the things that we've been focusing on in the last 1 year of the transformation process is how can we improve the way in which we do norms and standards and guidelines. And we've identified gaps in that process. So I mentioned the clinical guidelines, which go through a very stringent process of review, and they go through something called the grade process, which looks at the strength of evidence and so on before they can get into guidelines. It takes quite a length of time, and it takes some resources, substantial resources. But there are a number of other products that WHO produces which don't go through the guideline review committee, but which are also, you could call them recommendations or strategies, but they're basically giving advice for countries to adopt. And so this is the area we're looking at to see how can we streamline better. And a good example, I think, is the R&D blueprint, where WHO actually first prioritized those diseases which are likely to cause big outbreaks and epidemics, and then went on to develop target product profiles for diagnostics. So we've seen now with Ebola the impact that had in really pushing, accelerating the development of diagnostics. And right now there's a therapeutic clinical trial going on with 4 different products in DRC. But also Lassa fever, where just last week there was a meeting in Nigeria to finalize some protocols, and CEPI is involved in that as well. So really bringing the partners together, but having that the R&D blueprint and the target product profiles had a huge impact on driving R&D. So I think we need to think about, and I know it's done for TB, it's done in different diseases, but for a manufacturer or a pharma company or a vaccine company to have a target product profile is extremely helpful. But it can also go one step further, because if they then produce a product which ticks all the boxes, then it should make it simpler for WHO to also take it through the approval process much more rapidly, because you set out at the beginning what the terms were and the boundaries under which you'd like a particular product. And if you get a product that met all those, there should be no reason for many, many years to pass before that can be then approved. So we're going to hopefully start piloting this new approach in 2019. And I know that many of you would be very interested in that, and we'll be very happy to sit down and talk to some of you about how best we can make this work. Because I think each of us has to do our bit in this ecosystem. So WHO has a role, the PDPs have their role, the manufacturers have their role, the advocates and the civil society have their role, but also I think we mustn't forget national organization and institutions. And in everything that we do now onwards, whether it's research or training, we're going to try and identify national institutions and in country like the Mycetoma Research Center, and just empower them and give them whatever they need in terms of technical backup, expertise, resources, so that they can do a better job. And that's the only way I think we will see growing investments in this area, to get the countries who are affected by these diseases to take it seriously and to start investing. So while we hope that the big funders would continue to increase and maintain their investments, I think the hope is that we see many more new funders or small funders now stepping up in a much more significant way. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to stay, of course, as long as possible, because I'm very keen to hear from the panelists. Thank you. And congratulations on the report.
Thank you very much, Soumya. We know what a busy time it is at WHO right now with the executive board and all the other meetings that then relate to it. So we're much appreciative that you've been able to come and also, on the one hand, put out some challenges, but on the other hand, also brief us on some of the innovations that are happening at WHO to try and take this field forward and bring products to people much more rapidly than we have been able to do so far. We'll now hear about the report, its major results. Anna Doubell, who's the Director of Research at Policy Cures Research, will present it to us. Anna, please.
Thank you, Ilona. It's a privilege to share the stage with you, as well as with our distinguished panel members. And thank you very much to Soumya for visiting us and giving us such a great introduction to the report today. Now, if I had intended to keep you in suspense as I worked up to announcing the findings of the report today, I probably should have reconsidered the title of the report, Reaching New Heights. It really needs a bit of a spoiler alert. Funding for neglected disease research and development reached its highest level ever. It got $3.5 billion last year. Funding grew by 7% after increasing the prior year as well, and that's only the second time that we've ever seen 2 consecutive years of funding growth since the survey began. The staff at Policy Cures Research have many talents, and most of us are data nerds. We're really cautious about throwing around the term highest ever. We feel it's particularly important because our data is used by the WHO to monitor how much money member states are investing in PDPs. It's used by the G7 to promote transparency and accountability. It's used by governments to inform their policy decisions. And it's used by advocacy organisations, academics, and lots of other parties in the field. So we wanted to make really sure that when we say highest ever, we really mean it. We know that there have been variations in the survey over the past 11 years. Of course, the number of organisations who participate in the survey each year fluctuates. The diseases and products that we capture in our scope has expanded a little over those 11 years. But we have reviewed thousands of lines of data. We've looked at hundreds of responses from the organisations, and we've reconciled those responses, and we've cut the data every which way. We're confident that this win is legitimate. After almost a decade, we have finally beaten the high of 2009. So let's look at those 2 periods of growth, the one that fueled the peak in 2009 and today's. In both the cases, the growth was driven by public investment, but that's essentially where the similarities end. In 2009, we saw the US government pump money into R&D to stimulate the domestic economy after the global financial crisis. And most of that investment went to academic institutions, which typically focus on basic research, and to US-based biotechs. This year, it's a totally different story. Yes, the money came from the public sector, but this time there was a force of a broader range of countries. It was driven by the UK government, the European Commission, and also had support from Germany, India, and South Africa. So there were 2 departments within the UK government that made big changes. Firstly, there was DFID. So following a strategic review of their portfolio, they increased funding to PDPs, and this was really across the board. So there was malaria, kinetoplastids, TB, HIV. They all got a bump up. And then there was a new stream of funding from the Department of Health and Social Care, and this is a player that we don't usually see active in this field. But they made a contribution of $40 million, and a lot of that went to the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trial Partnership, EDCTP, but it also went to a couple of PDPs for malaria and TB. The European Commission was the other big mover. The EC has a couple of avenues that it uses to fund neglected disease research and development. The first is its framework program, so at the moment it's Horizon 2020, and the other one is the EDCTP. And this year, their contributions to EDCTP increased to the highest level ever. And that reflects the increased budget of EDCTP too. Where else did the funding come from? Once again, the US government provided the most, with 69% of public funding. And then, as I said, you've got the UK and the EC who are big movers. Then, as Soumya mentioned, India led the charge amongst the funders from LMICs, but its place on a global scale really needs to be recognised. So for the second year, India is the fourth largest public funder, and that's ahead of France and Germany, both in terms of absolute funding as well as its proportion of GDP. Germany, whose growth continued to increase, hit a record high in 2017, clearly establishing itself as the most significant European funder after the UK and European Commission. And then we have the French, Dutch, Australian and Japanese governments, all really stable. We'd love to see growth here, but stable is better than a decline. And then South Africa provided its highest level of funding ever, returning to the top 12 in ranked number 11. And South Africa really outperformed when you look at its contribution as a proportion of GDP. It's behind only the US and the UK. Last year, we highlighted the contributions made by some emerging funders, organisations like Unitaid and MSF. And you can see here the difference between their funding in 2009 and in 2017. For a long time, MSF really only funded neglected disease research through DNDi, being a founding member of this organisation. But in recent years, it's both increased funding and it's more than doubled the 2009 levels, and it's moved to a more diverse range of R&D projects. Unitaid, as I'm sure Sanne will talk about later, has moved from funding purely access to products to also funding R&D for products, and its latest strategic plan now explicitly includes innovation. So combined, these changes had quite an impact. The gap between the US government and the next largest funder shrank to the lowest level ever. We spoke last year about the outsized role that the US plays. Of course, we don't want to see the US reduce its commitment. We just want to see the other countries and other organisations step up. And that's exactly what we saw this year. So the US increased by 1.5%, but because of this growth from the next band of funders, the gap narrowed. Now, there wasn't as much growth from industry investment. The story's a little bit complicated because we had some participation from organisations that haven't been involved in the survey in the past. With their data, industry funding went up. Without their data, industry funding went down. So a bit complicated, but having looked at the numbers, we're conservatively saying that it was just slightly down in 2017. But we shouldn't focus just on the 2016-17 change, just those 2 years of data, because there have been 5 years of consecutive growth from industry investment. So this levelling off doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be ringing the alarm bells. We know that industry investment is driven by the state of the product pipeline, and if you go to the data online and take a look at industry's investment in Vivax drugs over time, as an example, you can see the pattern that reflects tafenoquine's progress through late-stage trials. So it's only natural that in some years you're not going to have as much growth as you've had in others. We're also buoyed by the fact that industry investment is a lot more diversified than either public or philanthropic funding. So in the public sector over the last 11 years, we see the top 3 organisations, on average, they account for 73% of funding. And for philanthropic sector, it's 97%. But in industry, those top 3 organisations only account for 55%. And the top few players tend to change ranks a little bit more than philanthropic or public, which are a lot more, stable. So we think that as long as this diversity is maintained, it should help guard against any precipitous drops. We're also hopeful that industry investment will rebound, as there's a strong pipeline of early stage candidates which will hopefully progress through to clinical trials. Okay, so where did the money go to? We have an increase of $232 million. Where was it spent? As expected, most of the money went to HIV, malaria and TB. All 3 diseases received more money in 2017 than in 2016. That said, they're by no means at their record highs. And as I mentioned, there was a bit of change in some survey participation, so that HIV number is affected by the organisations that respond to us. And then we have helminths, diarrheal diseases, cryptococcal meningitis. Now, cryptococcal meningitis, for a disease that really doesn't receive all that much funding, it doubled. But you can see that at this point we start to narrow off to really quite marginal increases. And then we have the decreases. We've got salmonella infections, and that decreased by about 12%, but that's following many years of very, very strong growth. So it's not necessarily reason to panic. Hepatitis C continued its decline following the registration of direct-acting antivirals. And then there was bacterial pneumonia and meningitis and dengue. But if I look at all of those changes, once you net them out, you get to a change of about 100 million. And we know that there's a change of 232 million. Where is the difference? And this is where the suspense kicks in. The answer lies in the final category, and that cannot be allocated to one disease. That's not just a catch-all that we use. It's made up of 4 components, and by far the largest component, and the one that really accounts for all of this, almost all of this growth, is core funding. And this is where we see the European Commission and the Department of Health and Social Care, their funding for EDCGP, that goes into core funding. So that's where we're seeing that come through. If we ranked core funding next to the diseases, it would actually fall between TB and diarrheal diseases. So number 4, it's increased a lot over the past 11 years, and particularly in the past year. It's so important now that it even gets its own chapter in GFinder. And this just shows that growth in another way. You can see that the size of the bubbles indicates the absolute change, and red is bad and green is good. And you can see there the core funding increasing by 74% and larger than that increase in HIV. But it's important to not only look at the recent changes in funding, but also reflect on the sustained investment that we've seen in R&D over time. And that's where we can see that we're starting to reap the benefits. Last year we saw the approvals for fexinidazole for sleeping sickness, for moxidectin for river blindness, tefenoquine for Vivax malaria. We also had new vaccines for typhoid and rotavirus. And this is evidence that sustained investment and collaboration between industry and global health players can really make a difference. So there is heaps of good news. But obviously I'm not going to let you off that easily. We still are falling short of where we need to be. So although we reached a record high in 2017, not a single country met the WHO target of 0.01% of the GDP. And that 0.01% of GDP is what should be spent on research into health needs of developing countries. In fact, over the 11 years that GFinder has been running, only the US has ever met that target. This year, the US got 82% of the way there, UK got 71% of the way there, but no other country even made it halfway. It's fantastic to see the UK getting a lot closer to the target, and we are very encouraged to see the growth from this second band of funders from the EC, from the UK, Germany and India, to see Brazil outperforming based on GDP. But even with the diversification that we see in 2017, which has been brought about by this growth, funding is still too dependent on a handful of organisations. The US NIH, for example, one organisation accounted for 40% of global funding. My hope is that this time next year, we can have a similar conversation where we can celebrate even more record highs and more product success stories. But to do so, as Soumya said earlier, we need to see the existing funding streams that we know and we love, the US government, the Gates Foundation, industry, we need to see them continue their generosity and commitment. We need to see the increases that we've seen from the EC, Wellcome Trust, UK government, Unitaid, Indian, German government. We need to see those increases sustained. And we want to encourage that third band of funders, including from governments where these diseases are prevalent, to add to the diversity and the robustness of neglected disease R&D funding. Thank you.
So thank you very much also for the key messages, Anna, that you put together for us. It's really been intriguing to see that there is a more balanced picture to some extent, and particularly now being here in Europe to see greater European responsibility, but also, as Soumya has already alluded to, an increased responsibility of BRICS countries. And that could definitely be something for the future. I also like the point you made that despite the fact that you do annual reports, that it's important to keep in mind that one has to look at least at 5 years and then also regularly look at the longer term picture, at least at a decade, in order to be able to move things forward. And I was particularly intrigued, and I hope we'll take that up on the panel, is the shift in what is funded and the increased diversity, as you said, which could also be a trend that we want to look at more carefully. And I guess particularly interesting is the issue around the core funding. Sitting on the board of one or two of the organizations, the desperate look for core funding is one of the usual things discussed at boards, and so at least for those organizations, that's a very, very important message that donors have taken this up. So I'd now like to ask the panelists to please come up here. I'll stay standing here so that the stage is not so crowded. I think the architect, when he did this, was of the opinion there should never be more than 4 panelists. Rarely do meetings here at the Graduate Institute live up to that. So it's easier if I stay here. You will know some of the panelists. I'll just quickly introduce them. It's Sanne Wendes, who is the Chief of Staff at Unitaid. It's Dr. Nathalie Strub-Wourgaft, who is the Director of Neglected Tropical Disease Unit at DNDi. It's Dr. Pauline Williams, who's the Senior Vice President and Head of Global Health R&D at GSK. And it's Dr. Jacques, who is the co-head of the Division of Global Health Program, Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And finally, from the GFINDER group, Dr. Nick Chapman, who is the CEO, Policy Cures Research, and lead author of the GFINDER, and he knows by heart every single data point in that report and can pick up those elements. The way we thought we do it is to have each of the panelists explain a little bit in relation to the report, obviously, what this means for their organization, how they have moved forward. Some of them are funders, some of them are receivers, some of them are in research. So we'll start with Unitaid, where we heard of, a really major shift in the way that Unitaid acts in this space, and I hope Sanne will tell us a little bit about the rationale and where you're going. Sanne, please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So we're very happy to be here and very happy to be able to contribute to the results as well that we've had and how this fits in the larger picture. At Unitaid, we don't see a big dichotomy between what is R&D, what is access, what is innovation, and where do you actually draw the lines. I think it's very interesting to do so, and it's very helpful to do so in some senses, but we see this as a continuum, and I think it's important for us to recognize that we need to find a pathway where the needs on the ground feed into the R&D agenda, and where we find the pathway of how to bring those through to the system to actually overcome some of those access barriers that exist so that we can get the impact we're all looking for on the ground. And this is probably one of the big shifts that has happened in Unitaid over the last years, is taking a very holistic view of what is needed in the different areas that we're working in to be able to create that impact. And that has led Unitaid in some senses to what we call go a little bit further upstream than what we've done in the past. And I think these numbers are showing, are reflective of that evolution of our portfolio. But it's also saying that we need to take this very holistic view of the need. So Unitaid is an organization, we were created in 2006. And we have active grants projects of $1.5 billion. And so here you saw 50 million of disbursements in 2017, which were being able to be categorized as R&D in this. But it fits in a larger portfolio of $1.5 billion and 40 projects across HIV, TB, and malaria, but also hepatitis C. We support WHO pre-qualification as a very important critical step in bringing some of these products through the pipelines as well. And we're increasingly looking at investing in other areas as well now, thinking that we need to stop thinking in silos of diseases, and we need to actually start thinking much more about what the needs are of the populations that we have, which are not in silos. And so we need to think about the patients that we have in front of us in the countries that need our support and what their health needs will be. And this has led us to, for example, now develop projects in fever management. Let's stop thinking about malaria and fever as being malaria, but actually think about how do we manage cases of fever more broadly. Other examples of this bringing us away are the development of projects within cervical cancer. Screening, testing, and treatment of precancerous lesions, for example. And these are examples of areas that we're showing where we are moving beyond these silos of the diseases. Very briefly to speak about what we mean when we say market access barriers. So what we're seeing is products come through the R&D pipeline, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be accessible to the people on the grounds. You need products that are adapted to the population groups who need them. So we work very heavily, and these numbers reflect a lot of the work that we're doing on pediatrics, adaptation of products to pediatric versions. You need them at the right quality. You need WHO to be able to provide guidance on these new products and innovations that are coming through. You need to work on affordability so that they can become accessible. And we work on creating sustainable competition where it's needed, or work on overcoming IP barriers as well, if that is a product if that's a problem in terms of affordability. You need supply and delivery systems to be in place to be able to reach the populations that need them. And critically and very important, you need demand and adoptions. You need communities to understand what these products are, why they need them, and demand them of their governments as well. All of these are what we call market barriers that need to be overcome so that countries can take on these products and bring them to scale, or other larger funders, which are not us, such as the Global Fund or the US bilateral programs or other bilateral programs, can take them to scale. So that's just a very brief overview of how we see this continuum and need to focus on R&D all the way through to delivery on the ground for us to have the impact we're looking for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sanne, and we'll be able to pick up on some of those points afterwards. I'll move on to Nathalie, please, and we'll hear from DNDi some of the changes that have happened there that are reflected in the data. Particularly, I hope also the way that you've been involved in partnerships, and we heard particularly the moves in South Africa, where you're also very active. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity of discussing this important report. I think the reason why DNDi was invited this time was, in fact, to celebrate and to show that it's possible to invest and to get results. Not only have we developed and managed successfully to reach approval of fexinidazole, but our colleagues from MMV have managed to develop tafenoquine. We've seen moxidectin, 2 new vaccines. So I think one of the key messages to avoid repetition of what was previously said is that it's feasible. We can do it. Your investment, or our investment, our work, achieves the success we're all striving for. And fexinidazole as a new treatment for sleeping sickness will contribute directly to UHC because it's an oral treatment, because patients will not necessarily need to go and travel and pay or not get the income they need, because they live in remote areas and they need to go search for treatment, and by doing this they cannot get their own income. So directly or indirectly contributing to at least not increasing poverty, and in fact probably decreasing the poverty of these patients. So that's clearly an objective, and we have managed this. And we have managed this with a budget that, when you think about it, was about 70 millions, 55 from DNDi and 13 from in-kind from the industry. So really, when you think of the benefit and the value you get out of this, it's really high, and that's something that's not just for DNDi. Of course, it's applicable to the way we work and what we do. The other things which are very important in this report is in fact, the emergence of new countries, but countries that are now engaging in investing for their own patients, for their own communities, which is one of the things that is key to maintain an interest in continuing the work, and also continuing with access. Because, of course, what's not in the report is the access and how much do we need to invest to ensure the transition, which is something also that we see, as you mentioned, this thing about the last mile. I don't know if we can quantify how much we need to invest for the last mile, but we are discussing this precisely for sleeping sickness because we're very close. And we know that, the cost per next patient will be much higher than the cost for the clinical development. So that is something we need to understand a little bit better. The other things that we see is that we see continuous and sustained support from the key funders, the traditional ones that you've mentioned, the countries, the DFID, the Germany, France, and others, whilst the emerging are coming, but also sustained investment from big traditional philanthropic funders, which are very important. We see that is pretty stable over time. The last 2 points I'd like to make is one, and thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan, for mentioning mycetoma. Mycetoma is not in the report, so it seems it doesn't exist. So is it because there's so little funding that you don't have even a line for mycetoma, or is it for other reasons like the other NTDs which are not there? So for us, it's important to see this. It's a signal that something is wrong for these other diseases. Another one that is directly in our portfolio, and because you're putting together all the kinetoplastids. You see, Chagas is silent. It is so silent that, of course, it's not also on your list. Well, it's there, but it's not highlighted. And what we see is that there's very little funding for Chagas. So Chagas doesn't get the attention. Patients with Chagas silently, but slowly and certainly, 30% of them will die of Chagas. They'll just die silently as we don't speak about Chagas. So, and we don't fund Chagas. Chagas is not funded. Chagas benefits the good thing, it benefits from core funding. But, we'd like to see more earmark funding for Chagas as well. So that was my almost last point. The last one is that you very well highlight that there's still need for more funding. We're at 3.6, it was 2.9 in 2009, so an increase. That's really nice. I think maybe some of you in the audience or others have made some super reports saying that we should reach about 8 or 10 billions if we want to reach the goals. Whilst on the other side, it's some economists, and I'm not an economist, so don't ask me, but have shown that it's much cheaper to, it's beneficial to tackle NTDs, and it would bring huge values in terms of economic benefit for patients for a lower investment than just other big topics that need to be addressed. So I think we hopefully will discuss also maybe new mechanism for funding and for sustained funding. I'll stop here.
Thank you for that. Nick, why don't you respond directly to some of the questions that were raised?
Yes, this is on. So I think that's a really good question. One, I think 2 points that have been raised that I was keen to address both of is, one is the extent to which, GFinder tracks investment in basic research and product development, and it has a relatively strict definition. And we think, I believe, that that's really important to track. But it absolutely is not, it does not exist in a silo. And that's, to some extent, I think GFinder does, or not just GFinder, but any effort to track and demarcate funding and define, the extent of the R&D spectrum to which we're going to track funding for, which is important. It does create the impression that we are only interested in this up to registration and phase 4, that we're not interested in beyond. And so I think that's one really important thing, a message to take home, and is that although we think that tracking investment in this area is critically important, we are not saying that we shouldn't be tracking investment beyond that area. We worked with TDR and the Global Malaria Program and other partners, including some of the PDPs, to do a pilot extension of the GFinder in malaria to look at research for implementation, so including operational research, health systems research, social science research. And we found significant challenges in finding that data, but I think that that's something that needs to be pursued. The question about whether mycetoma should be in, I think this is not my decision, not our decision. It's decided by the advisory committee of international experts, but it's something that is reviewed every year, and I personally think that there is an argument for mycetoma to be in, and that the reason that it hasn't been in was because there was insufficient knowledge previously about the extent of the burden and the degree to which biomedical solutions, particularly around diagnosis, could be important. And so it has, and some of the other diseases like coccal meningitis, which was only included halfway through, other diseases, the smaller neglected tropical diseases that have been included over the course of the project, in some ways suffer from an additional degree of neglect because there is so little knowledge about the pathophysiology of disease. There is so little investment that they are left out of things like GFinder.
Thanks for that. In terms, of return on investment, also at the WEF panel, the usual figures of 1 to 18, 1 to 20 were put forward, whereas it was nice to listen to Peter Sanne sort of saying, as a banker, 1.2 was already quite something. So, we do juggle with other types of figures, and it would be very good to know in this area where there's a difference in terms of investment in diseases, where investing in them jointly brings a tremendous payoff, and what that really means for countries. We've heard about the diversity that emerges also from the cooperation of the industry. Pauline, tell us what's been happening at GSK and possibly also the cooperation you have with other partners in this space.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, it's great to be in a forum where the role of the private sector is celebrated rather than derided or at worst disregarded. And I think one of the comments that I wanted to make more generally, rather than specific to GSK, is that I think we've already been noted that there are going to be peaks and troughs depending on the movement of portfolio in any given year. But the trend is looking positive, and great to see some more SMEs joining the contribution. And also, I think we should be careful not to focus too much on how much is being spent, but what's important is how effectively it's being spent and what is the impact of that spend as well. And one of the things that we've done recently in GSK is try and be much more coordinated, actually within GSK across ViiV, our HIV company, Pharma, which I lead on the global health, and vaccines, and Alan Saul is here representing that. And actually to look at synergies across what we're doing in that space. And then also, what can we do more effectively in partnership? Now, we have really well-established partnerships, and I imagine that every private sector contributor listed in this GFinder report is in partnership in some form with funders, with PDPs, etc. But what we're not very good at is partnering with each other. And this is a space where we really should not be competing. And so we're starting to think much more constructively about how can we share our resource, work in this non-competitive space, and really share our maximise our investment in this space. Speaking personally, we've just had a success with tafenoquine being approved by the FDA and the TGA in Australia last year, and now moving into registrations in endemic countries. And that's really just the start of the journey. It's been a very long and very expensive journey. We did benefit from the FDA incentive mechanism, the priority review voucher, but that doesn't go anywhere close to the total cost of that R&D. And in parallel, there's also, I should mention that we've been working very, very closely with Medicines for Malaria Prevention, and been partners in that, and they will be taking the lead on the implementation piece, together with PATH, who've been overseeing delivery of the diagnostic, not the diagnostic for the disease, but for G6PD deficiencies, so to ensure safe use. And those two things need to converge. So really an important partnership that's a global community now looking at how we address malaria vivax. But that touches on some points that Soumya raised, which is this integration now of you can meet the TPP from an efficacy and a safety perspective, but how do you really meet that real-world evidence and the value component? And I think the more we can think about that much earlier on and integrate that thinking between the WHO and the regulators and ministers of health in terms of our payer community, what is needed that we can build into the clinical trials earlier so that we're not then subject to long and expensive post-marketing commitments on top of quite complex pharmacovigilance commitments as well, in countries where that infrastructure simply isn't there, so the companies themselves need to undertake those activities. And also, how can we, from a broader perspective, from an R&D perspective, think about how we can get more bang for our buck? So how can we do trials that are faster and cheaper and more effective, and we can use innovative trial designs? We can work with regulators to think about more innovative designs. We heard about some in terms of head-to-head. Again, in this non-competitive space, we should be picking the winner. And in many diseases where they're combination treatments, how can we really be thinking more innovatively about testing the optimal combination? And Gates are leading that, a great conversation with TD squared, and a new model for TB combination therapy testing. And also working much more closely, as I said, with regulators in terms of acceptability of those designs. And mentioned PRV as one incentive mechanism. We're very lucky in GSK and I think in other companies that really prioritise global health. And I talked about generosity. This is not about generosity. We're not part of a corporate social responsibility piece of GSK. We're actually embedded in the core R&D function. And so our net present value valuation is really about social impact and value. But I think incentive mechanisms do go a long way to make sure that we have got a sustainable investment. And so I think more innovation in that, what makes it financially sustainable in terms of return on investment is important as well. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, and thanks for indicating also the changes within industry and within your company, where I'm sure we're going to see much more of this, that it moves out of the charity mode actually into, you know, the central core of companies. Our final panelist is Jacques from the STC. STC has been a very sustainable PDP funder. But STC is also very much committed to the universal health coverage agenda. So I'm sure, Jacques, you're going to bring this together brilliantly and explain to us also, as you look forward, what does STC want to see in order to continue funding this space, please?
Thank you, Ilona, and thank you for inviting SDC to this panel. We are very pleased to be here, although I have to apologize. Alex Schulze, who is our expert in these matters, unfortunately could not make it for reasons which are beyond his control. So I have to replace him, and I will try my best. So yes, Ilona, SDC is very much involved in promoting UHC, and we consider that the access to medical product is critical to achieve UHC. And as our mandate is to fight against poverty, then of course neglected tropical disease or disease related to poverty should have a certain priority. But our support to R&D is part of a broader portfolio which is called access to medical product, which means it's just a part of it, because we also work on registration with the AMRH in sub-Saharan Africa. We also deal with the issues of supply chain management and quality of services, prescription and compliance. So it's far broader, but we are still very pleased to be part of the top 10 public funders, although we will be challenged, and we hope in the future we can increase, but at present we are not too sure, so let's see. This report is very encouraging, and congratulations. Not only is there a growth, but there's a diversification, so that shows the issue of financing R&D is gaining ground, but there's still a long way to go. And here I would support the point made by Pauline. If we have less resources and if we have so many other diseases and public health priorities which are not well covered, then we must look for efficiency gains. And here we've been supporting certain process, and we are very happy the way it developed. For instance, TDR has developed this portfolio to impact with the Duke Institute. And that's a very important process, because it goes beyond just the basic R&D. And also there's the new product profile directory, which is allowed to get a broader view on where we can find efficiency gains. And in the end of the day, I think for the donors also, we have to be more serious and contribute more core funding, because that's the way we can give flexibility to the PDPs so that they can adjust their portfolio to the emerging needs or to the needs which have been insufficiently covered. And that's why we are very keen in SDC to support core funding. We enter into earmarked funding when there's an opportunity or a clear request, but normally we try to stick to core funding. And the last thing is that we would really encourage the PDP to better work together. You said it before. The example is sleeping sickness between DNDi and FINDER. That's a very productive way of moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Nick, you wrote much of the report. What would you like to write in the next report?
Well, I think Anna said it very well, that we'd like to stand here in a year with more positive news. I think what we have seen now is really, it is unprecedented in many ways. I mean, it's unprecedented in terms of the total level of investment. It's unprecedented in terms of the record investment from many of the top funders, the highest ever UK investment, close to highest ever EC investment, highest ever German investment, highest ever Indian investment, highest ever South African investment. I mean, we are seeing Unitaid and other partners investing at levels that they haven't before. We're seeing more success than ever before. You know, we talked about the number of product approvals just in 2018 alone for really, really high impact products. And we've got a larger pipeline of products, and we've got more interest in looking at mechanisms for sustainable investment. But the flip side of that is that with so many people doing more now than they ever have before, you know, any sort of regression away from these current excellent levels would be a step backwards and put at risk many of the products in the pipeline and the opportunities to take those forwards. So, I mean, it's a bit of a facile statement, a little bit, but I would like to be sitting here again to say that no, we haven't gone backwards from where we are now, and indeed we have seen that the people that invested, the newer investors who are playing a much bigger role, are continuing to meet those levels.
Yeah, I was asking because, of course, in general, there's a big concern in global health, how much money there's going to be available. Your data are from 2017 and 2018. There was a lot of political debate around which countries deal with their own problems first and not be so concerned about multilateralism. So it would be interesting to see whether what's sort of happening in the political sphere is starting to reflect itself in this financing sphere. And of course, additionally, we are going to have in the next 2 years the big replenishment activities of 4 big global initiatives, the 3 funds and the polio, and whether that in any way is also going to reflect and eat into this space. So I think some of that analysis will be very important, and of course related to the advocacy then one has to keep that in mind, because 14 billion for the global fund, and again at the WEF debate it was said that initially they were going to suggest 18 billion, and that Bill Gates said be a little bit more careful, let's go for 14. But there's going to be a lot of pressure on donors, and there's not yet that many new donors around. So all of that coming together, including a very strong investment case put forward by the World Health Organization. So we're going to see a lot of activity in the next 2 years that will be very, very critical. Jacques, how do donors in this space talk to each other? Do they discuss these kind of things? Do they challenge each other? Do you say, hey guys, you should be putting more money into PDPs? Or, how does that work amongst yourselves?
Of course.
Good.
We try to encourage others, of course. Yeah. But, I mean, the key topic now is UHC. And access to medicine is just a subset. And I'm not sure certain donors realize how important the medical product is for the achievement of UHC. There's still a long way to go because, of course, in our high-income countries, it's not an issue. So we don't consider it. We tend to ignore it, whereby if you go in a low-income country, it's so critical. If you want to finance sustainably a system, then you need to ensure a basic service to the people, and if they don't get the medicine, and the medicine is critical for a basic service. So definitely it's an issue which is overlooked, and we try to bring it always in the broader picture of access to medical products, the whole chain. It needs a whole system to access. It needs more than just R&D, but R&D is critical, of course, for NTDs. So.
Thank you. Could the other panelists say a short piece on how you see your work feeding into this UHC primary healthcare agenda? Because it really is the way that Jacques said that on the one hand, in many cases, the 2 discussions aren't linked sufficiently. On the other hand, we rarely analyze in great detail what changes the development of a certain product actually means for a service. You know, if suddenly you don't need to go every week to your health service, but the new product allows you to actually only go every half year. If a digital development allows you to actually stay away from the center maybe for a year, rather than go there regularly and move forward. So could you link some of what you've put forward to this pressing universal health coverage agenda, which is in the center of debates, of global health debates now, and will be the subject at the UN General Assembly? And what at present we're sort of experiencing is different disease areas coming in and saying, you know, what does UHC mean for NCDs and for this and for that and the other? And how do we integrate that? And how do we make sure that political message comes across to donors and decision makers? Sanne, would you like to start?
Sure. I think this is a really good question, and it's a very timely question, and one that I think we're all grappling with. In Unitaid, it's reflected in our strategy through our commitment to integration. And I spoke a little bit about it before, but the need to look at what the health needs of patients are in different settings. And then a very important point, which for us is when we invest in health products, and we don't do normal, what other organizations would say health system strengthening. However, health products play a huge role in health system strengthening. And the way that we look at it is how we invest in health products that impact health systems. So the way we look at it is how will the products that we want to invest in actually impact the health systems in a cost-effective manner. And examples of investments that we're making and that are included in this report are, for example, point-of-care diagnostics. Early infant diagnostics, but also point-of-care diagnostics for HIV, bringing the services as close to the populations as possible, bringing easy-to-use technologies that need less educated health workers to use them, but also other areas where, for example, also in diagnostics, we have a very large portfolio in HIV self-testing. One of the major gaps in HIV is getting people to come and get tested. And we've shown that we're getting to the limit of our capacity to bring people into health clinics. So we're thinking about how do we actually think and turn that on its head and bring the services to the people so that they, in the privacy of their own homes, can actually look at this. So those are examples of areas that we're looking at. And going forward, we'll be investing in some quite interesting areas. Our board just approved an area for intervention, as we call it, in long-acting technologies. So how do we move towards injectables or towards long-acting medicines or towards implants or others that mean that you need to address the health systems less frequently and therefore hopefully also will increase adherence, will reduce the development of resistance. All of these elements which will build the health system and hopefully attain greater impact. So these are some of the ways that we're thinking about our contribution to the larger UHC agenda.
Thank you. Nathalie?
Yes, so first of all, NTDs affect poor people and nourish the vicious poverty cycle. So immediately, by providing a solution for these NTDs, you will at least cut the vicious cycle, but that's not enough. So if we talk concretely, there's two things. One thing is that whilst we have been developing, making these clinical trials for these, for example, for sleeping sickness, we have directly provided an improvement of the healthcare facilities because we had to bring some new technologies, for example, to measure safety, which we try to make sustainable technology that they can benefit from in the future. We also brought some new knowledge in terms of, I don't know, resuscitation or things, which will help the system, whatever, along the way. But the ultimate goal, of course, is to have a treatment that changes the patient's lives, those that are affected. And I would say also by changing the patient's lives, for example, sleeping sickness or mycetoma or visceral leishmaniasis, patients never come alone to a center, and that's the same for malaria. I think everybody knows that. When you go to a center, the children, which we maybe have not spoken enough about, they don't come by themselves. They come with the mother that by coming will not be able to do other things, etc. So I don't think we are very good at measuring this. And in fact, donors want us to show this type of benefit. But clearly, if we can remove the need for a mother to leave home, to take not care of other children, but to be there, etc., with another treatment that is easier for her to take, that doesn't require that she maybe the father doesn't cannot work and have the little income. That's another direct benefit. For mycetoma, which was mentioned earlier, the patients did not want to come in the clinical trial because they could not pay to verify if they had a mycetoma lesion or not, because they had to take the bus, and the bus was too expensive. That's it. It's as simple as that. So if we have options that, help them to be diagnosed, because that, I think I fully agree that, diagnosis is key to what we do. And that's the integration as well. You were mentioning integration between also, collaboration with PDPs. We have to work with diagnostic PDPs, and we do for HAT and others as well. So all these things directly and indirectly contribute to the patient's better life, but also their family and then their environment. Mm-hmm. Pauline?
Thanks. Well, to build on that point, I mentioned earlier around the importance of integrating not only efficacy and safety measurements in phase 3 trials, but actually that value evidence. And I think for our commercial portfolio, we're extremely good at that whole pharmacoeconomic case building, and I think integrating that into global health and really sharing some of the private sector expertise more broadly, I think is going to be really important in terms of demonstrating that true value of the medicine in the entirety of that healthcare system. There's also a component of capacity building piece that isn't captured in the report, but I think goes alongside that. And I think another thing that I wanted to mention that I've started within my own team is create, as a little nascent group at the moment, but a Global Health Futures group that really recognises the fact that when we're starting out in R&D, it's a good 10 to 15 years before that asset is going to reach the patient. And the environment in which that product is going to reach the patient is going to look really different in that time frame in terms of the change in environment for these emerging economies. And so how do we think ahead and really build our clinical development program with that in mind and build in what that infrastructure is going to be, integrating digital technology, access to mobile phones, etc. And the whole way that a patient is going to receive information about their disease, healthcare seeking behaviour, and information about the medicine and its safety profile is going to look very different. So I think starting to think ahead and plan for that, as opposed to assume that everything's going to be static, which I think is a critical point.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up to the audience now, but before I take other questions, I'd like to take the opportunity of taking advantage of quite a big German delegation that's here from the NTD network and ask them to explain to us why they think the figures went up in Germany. Was it your advocacy? Was it a certain minister? What happened?
It's very easy to say it's because of our advocacy. We do hope so, but I think that's because the German government is thinking about now to set up a new global health strategy. They're also thinking about NTDs and all these fields, and so there's a movement within the different ministries ongoing. And I think therefore the topic is just on the table, and then we are asking, please do something, and here and there, and then it's a dynamic situation at the moment in Germany, and I think this is the reason why there is some more money in this field, and we hope that this will become sustainable, and also with this new global health strategy, and we are doing a lot. I mean, global health, I think if I would ask everyone here, please define global health, everyone will have another definition, so it's really hard to what does fit in, and what should fit in and what should not fit in, and this is only NTDs and so on, and NCDs and so on and so forth. And I think we have to make sure that the NTDs will be still in the focus and not being putting out because of all the other things upcoming.
So you're going to continue your advocacy, are you?
I'll just take the...
You've got a mic to move around, then I can stay here. Okay. So who'd like to make a contribution, pose a question? Yes, please go ahead, and please always introduce yourself.
My name is Dirk Engels. Some of you may remember me from WHO, where I ended as director of the NTD department. I'm now on my own, an independent consultant, but still doing advocacy for NTDs.
Now, I wanted to make next to you. Come on right. Your own.
Now, I wanted to make two comments, actually. The one is on efficiencies. Increasing efficiencies in product development. What strikes me is that, yes, the global situation in investment is getting better, but the neglected diseases remain relatively neglected, if not frankly neglected. Now, let me give you the example of diagnostics, for instance. Because of good progress in control of, and I'm going to use the neglected tropical diseases now, there's a huge need for new diagnostics in order to get to the targets that we have set for ourselves. I believe there's a huge opportunity to use existing platforms that all the big diseases are using to get to diagnostics for multiple neglected diseases according to the way you have to use them, whether it is point of care or high throughput, depending what you need as use. And again, the rhetoric goes in that sense. When it comes to real action, it blocks. The second comment I wanted to make is about funding. And we have a bit of a similar situation. The rhetoric is going to universal health coverage, primary healthcare funding, of which everything should be part, but we know that that is not automatic, of course. And then on the other hand, you have a drive towards these big funding cycles and these replenishment cycles, the Global Fund, the GFF, Gavi, that do attract a lot of money. And that's the positive side. In today's world, global health still attracts a lot of money. But on the other hand, the neglected diseases, and now I don't mean only neglected tropical diseases, may fall out of these big boats. And then we are entering in a new cycle of new neglect.
Nick, would you like to comment on that?
I mean, I think both of those are really, really good observations and salient observations. I think I see that, I mean, I think that one of the great things that we've seen here is evidence of greater integration. You know, we have Unitaid, for example, who traditionally worked you know, in market shaping and access, and now has moved upstream. DNDi, who is working in the R&D space, but now moving more and more into access. We have organisations like DNDi, like FIND in the diagnostic space, who are working across diseases rather than just in disease silos. So I think that's really positive. And I feel that within that, whilst promoting greater and greater integration and breaking down silos, having something like the GFINDER report, which highlights investment in these neglected diseases and focuses on, are we investing enough to develop new products, new diagnostics, drugs, vaccines, etc., for these diseases, is really important in a world where we are trying to move towards a model of integrated response to global health challenges and to universal healthcare.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks very much. My name is Suri Moon. I'm the Director of Research at the Global Health Center here. First, I wanted to congratulate our colleagues at GFINDER for another excellent report. And as a researcher, I really use quite often the data that you produce, and it's terrific to see how the project has evolved over the last 11 years now. So first, really congrats. Thank you to all the panelists for very insightful comments on the global R&D system. I think many of us were very encouraged to see the increase in funding from new donors, and the increase in particular from some of the emerging economies. What I think was missing a bit from the picture was China. And I'm wondering, I think this question is probably for Nick, and so if Ilona will humor me, I'd like to add a little one at the end for Sanne. But I'm wondering if you could comment on what is happening these days with R&D related to neglected diseases in China. I mean, a number of the diseases that you cover are not only the ones in the WHO list, but also others that certainly directly affect the Chinese population. We hear a lot about huge government investment, private investment in R&D, broadly in the pharmaceutical sector, lots of big firms setting up labs there. So is it a data availability problem? Is it that the R&D is not happening in these diseases? What's your hunch as to what's going on and why it's not so clearly listed in the list of countries? Very briefly, a question for Sanne from Unitaid. I think it's very exciting and interesting to see this shift over the last few years and an increased investment upstream, as you were saying. I'm wondering, to what extent do other donors that you're familiar with take this sort of broad system-wide view, looking at everything from the upstream all the way to the downstream funding? Because I think one of the big challenges we see is, in fact, coordination, collaboration among hundreds of different actors who are involved in each step of the process. And there are very few actors actually that have kind of this end-to-end overview and involvement in different stages. This might also be a question for our Swiss colleague, but to what extent is that something that donors do? Should they do more of that? Or are there other ways to try to improve some of the coherence across these very disparate stages, from the investment in innovation to actual health impact in a person's life?
Thank you. Soumya, why don't you start?
Right, so thank you, and thank you for that really important question. I think one of the things that we're realizing is that we are all part of a global health architecture, and all of us need to work very closely together to accelerate, to catalyze, and to get the impact that we are looking for. I don't think there are enough examples of that full end view out there. I think that the way that we look at it is that we don't exist in isolation. We actually don't exist if we're isolated. We absolutely need to interact with upstream partners to understand and anticipate what are the innovations that are going to come. We need to anticipate and work with countries, and that's probably the first thing, to say what are your needs and where do you need investments in. We need to engage with all of the partners around, so with the technical partners such as WHO, but also Stop TB, UNAIDS, etc. And very importantly, we need to engage with industry, with civil society. What are the needs and how can they help accelerate these new products? And then we need to work with the funders. And funders, I'm saying more largely, is not just donors, because I think we're also moving to a world where we have a lot of countries that have very, very great health needs that are transitioning away from traditional donor funding, both from bilaterals but also from the multilaterals. And that's something I think that we in the coming years need to ask ourselves the questions of: how do we help countries to respond to those health needs in UHC, et cetera, and make those investment choices on the most cost-effective tools that they need to be able to tackle the health situations that they have. Unitaid has some examples of actually convening partners together in some of these areas, for example, in diagnostics or in pediatric drug development, where we bring together both the R&D partners together with all of the partners along the line down into the funders and say, let's take a look at this portfolio. What's going on? Where is this evolving? Where do we need to adjust? And parts of those discussions lead us to reprogram and readjust our portfolio to meet the greatest needs. So I think on that, there are some examples that we definitely, and best practices that could be expanded into other areas, because I think, as others have said, we need to collectively work together to move this forward.
Thanks. Nathalie, does this kind of movement help you?
Absolutely. First of all, I forgot to mention affordability of treatments. I'm sorry, this is part of our TPP, but I think it's just a basis for UHC as well. No, so partnerships and collaboration from discovery up to the end with the different actors. This is in fact our model. Our model is building partnerships and using and identifying who will be the most relevant for that part of the value chain of the development. The first thing is to start with the TPP that we build in countries with the stakeholders and with the disease actors. So that's why we always say we have a TPP that includes the access component. Maybe we can elaborate more on access, in fact, improve our access TPPs, but that's clearly there. And then the rest will come from the partnerships, including trying to also engage in dialogue between the PDP funders. In fact, we have a PDP funders group, which we bring together so that they can discuss together and understand what we want to achieve and help us jointly to reach the same objective. We do the same with our industrial partners. We are right now discussing with some pharmaceutical company how we will work with them and others to develop a combination treatment for leishmaniasis. So I think the key is exactly this. It's very difficult to have a systematic approach to partnerships. It's just that partnerships are living organisms, and we need to be ready to grow them and to work and continue that. All aspects, including novel technology, including opening doors to other things which we are not familiar yet. I mean, artificial intelligence is there. There are many things which we have to continue and bring the best for these patients. Because, and I would say that the way we are doing things may benefit other, much different areas of research or other things. So we do bring added value to this by working like that. Okay.
Thanks, Pauline. China.
But China, we have
no. That's why I was going to Pauline. I was going to ask, in the digital industry, for example, in the car industry, in a whole range of industries, Chinese industry is moving in. And it's moving into Europe, it's moving into competition with US companies, etc. What's happening in the pharmaceutical space?
Well, I wasn't expecting that question. Actually, I was waiting for Nick to talk about China. Well, well, what I can talk about is I think there is a big role that China and the Chinese government can play in terms of the global health funding infrastructure and in R&D specifically. And we actually it's just moved into global health structurally in GSK, but have an infectious disease institute for public health based in Beijing that is twofold. One is capacity building in terms of clinical development expertise with a focus on HIV, HBV and TB, and then also a fellowship program as well, working very closely with the Chinese government. So I think there's but as I said earlier, this is not an area that we are competing. So if Chinese companies wanted to move into this space, then we would be welcoming them and wanting to work with them really closely. But I have to say that we've certainly not been approached by any players in that space to do so. So this has been more at a government level. That's all I can say. I don't know if other companies here have got more interaction, but certainly GSK doesn't.
Any input here? Yes, please, go ahead.
From the Gates Foundation perspective on China, and Nick, please jump in. And thank you to all the panelists on very, interesting individual perspectives, but also the end-to-end piece to Suri's question, point, should donors and funders be doing more? Absolutely. And we're still nascent at the Gates Foundation and learning how we do this end-to-end and how you bring the scaling up innovations and introduction into the early R&D discussions, etc. And I'm hoping that everybody else and the funders bring closer those departments because they're actually siloed within donors. And how do you bring those? And they seem to sort of groups now come together around individual portfolios. For example, for an enteric diarrheal vaccine, you bring everybody together, the WHO, the funders, the product developers, and more of this, I think, is starting to happen, which is encouraging. On China specifically, we realize it's a gap, and I'm going to leave Nick and Anna to comment on their thoughts on what they're going to be doing in future. But from the Gates Foundation's perspective, if you're not aware, we have tried to encourage the Chinese government to move more and fund in this space, and have set up a partnership in the last couple of years with Tsinghua University in Beijing for drug discovery for specifically for sort of antimicrobial resistance, but with a focus on malaria and TB. And that funding has interestingly not come from the Chinese national government, but from Beijing city, and it's been hard work. But it is things like that I think other funders potentially could do that to encourage some of the emerging markets to sort of share that burden and come in. And I know the Swiss have tried to do that with TDR at some point. And it's very encouraging, I have to say, to see this increase in funding from India. And it'll be interesting to see, if we can get some better China data, because it's very complex, it's very opaque right now, but they could play a bigger role. And they have this new South-South fund. So it's been used really small grants at the moment and for infrastructure, but it's a question of whether we can convince them as a global community to also step up on global health.
Nick, any point on data?
Yes, it's a wonderful question, Suri, and it is, the short answer is yes, it's a gap. And it's one that we are highly aware of and working to address. A slightly longer answer is, we talked a lot about the BRICS investment here. We get wonderful data from Brazil, from India, and from South Africa. China and Russia are gaps. In the case of Russia, it's primarily our understanding we are underselling their investment or involvement in TB and antimicrobial resistance, but they don't have a significant overlap with a lot of the G-Finder diseases outside of that. And again, that's primarily public sector. There's not a philanthropic or an industry investment there. In China, again, we definitely know that there is a gap. We understand or believe that the philanthropic sector investment in this area is essentially non-existent despite the presence of lots of high net worth individuals. Industry is very actively involved, but a lot of it is in sort of this is not meant to be disparaging, Me Too innovation and reformulation work rather than novel research in the neglected disease field. In the emerging infectious disease field, that's very different. And then in the public sector, we have worked for a long time to try and get data, and it's an issue of relationship building and a reluctance to share data from some of those institutions. And also a complicated funding structure where, as Soumya said, it's not just the national government, but the provincial and state CDCs and etc. But we're working to improve our coverage there.
Mm-hmm. Jacques, did you have a point on that?
Very briefly, we have contacts with China. They are interested to exchange with development agencies because they are setting up their development agencies. We have even one contact on the eradication of schistosomiasis in the Mekong region, but it's moving very slowly. And we have to discover each other and to see how we can progress. So it's really the phase of discovery, I would say, for us. Although we have a memorandum of understanding with China, and we hope in the future we can really put the higher gear.
Nathalie, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, sorry, no, it's just on access. There was one actor that I think we did not mention and we should not forget is the regulatory body or agencies. I think they are very key, and we are talking of agencies with variable experience and resources, etc. And I think the capacity building efforts that have been supported by DFID, the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, for example, in Africa, we should not forget, it's not, of course, directly related to the G-Finder or to the neglected diseases, but in a way it is, because they will have first frontline to approve these drugs for them. So it's linked in a way, and I think we just need to make sure that we do not exclude them from the conversations we were talking about earlier.
Nathalie, thanks very much for that, because on the one hand, as we move into the UHC space and say, you know, delivery, access, etc., the other big issue is institution building. And to look at, you know, what are the institutions that need to be in place if this is to work at a domestic level. And I mean, in financing, we frequently, of course, speak then about taxation and all these kind of things. But I would agree with you, we don't speak about, you know, regulatory capacity and agencies enough. And that, of course, then doesn't only apply to this area, it would apply to some of the NCD areas and others. So really having that capacity in a country, reliable, trust building, etc., will, I think, be absolutely critical. And we do have to regularly sort of keep it in mind. And that's also, you know, a health financing thing. You know, who does that capacity building? Who helps build those institutions? It's rather late that we have started supporting Africa in building centers for disease control, for example. I mean, you'd think it's a non-brainer to do that, you know, and how long has it taken until it's really gaining ground? And if one sees how well some of them work, those that exist, you know, it's enormous negligence, I would say, from the side of global health funding and donors to not have done something like that earlier. So I believe that kind of institution building is something that we should not neglect. Other comments, questions? So I'll collect these 3, 4. Please make them very short, and then we'll give the panel some final words. Very quickly, please. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alex Kong. I'm from the Access to Medicine Foundation. And my main question is around one of the GFinder report findings, which was that industry investment was far less concentrated, but it was still at 55% among the top 3. And I was curious if you think that there should be cause for alarm related to that, as well as if there's perhaps some sort of continuity downstream where it's, you mentioned interchangeability of the top 3 positions, but does that also apply to, say, the next 5 companies in that spot? As well as if we see diversity among the different diseases beyond HIV, TB, and malaria.
Thank you. Pass it down here, please, to the gentleman. No, there's a gentleman here, and then we'll go up there. Yes, quickly.
Okay, question for Nick. Alan Saul, GSK Vaccines Institute of Global Health. Fantastic job. You can't believe how important GFinder has been to us for 11 years now. The question I want to ask you really pertains to that 11 years. Funders are always, of course, interested in how effective their funding is. And I know Pauline raised this question that it's not just the amount of funding, but it's how effective we use it. But you're in a unique situation. You've got 11 years of comprehensive data that covers many more fields than most funders deal with. Do you have any plans to start teasing that longitudinal data out so we can get some ideas of best practice and how we can be more efficient about how we do our work?
Thank you. This lady here, please.
Yes, so I have 2 queries. One is regarding real and nominal values, because you're like comparing 2009 now, it's good gap, whether you've looked at that and whether the increase is true in real values is not just nominal values. And the other one, and I haven't had a chance, you may already have put it in the report, but do you have a breakdown of the spending separated by diagnostics, preventatives, and therapeutics? Thank you.
Thank you. And last one over here. I can't take any more.
Thank you. I'm Wele Malechela, Director, Neglected Tropical Diseases, WHO. Thank you very much. I just have 2 questions. One is linked to the last mile diagnostics, which Nathalie brought up, and the issue that within the last mile, when we're talking about elimination, it's definitely going to change. The diagnostics we're using now are not going to be as effective. How much are we really having a futures approach? And I loved when you said your futures group, Pauline, when you spoke about it. How much are we having a futures approach to diagnostics? And the second question, which was a question that Nathalie again brought up, was the issue of Chagas, Nick. And really, I mean, why is there the silence on shaggers? So I'll leave it to those two. Thanks.
Thank you. Who'd like to start? Go ahead.
Just a quick one to say a plug for shaggers. We do have a discovery effort in the area, and we're hoping to have a candidate selected this year. So there is some activity. It's just not. It's not sort of hitting the inflection points yet because it's been an early stage. But we're not ignoring it in GSK at least.
Pauline, thanks. Nathalie, response to any of the questions?
No, I think I would maybe ask Joseph here, who could talk about diagnostics, because he would be best positioned maybe to answer Mwele's question, which is so important. And for Chagas, I don't have the answer. So, yeah.
Thanks. I'll get a mic to Joseph in a minute. We'll continue first. Sanne, any responses? Please.
I don't think the questions were directly related to us, so I don't know if this is closing remarks, but I would just think that this has been hugely helpful and a very good discussion, and I think shows the range of actors that need to be involved to be able to promote some of these. And I think the more transparency we have in these type of data, I look forward to the response. I think the Access to Medicines Foundation's work on data in terms of industry is also another indicator of really, really helpful data. So I'll be listening very interestingly to what the response will be on that one specifically. But these initiatives are very welcome.
Thank you. Joseph, you have a mic?
Yes, I do.
Please.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good and very important question. And
just say who you are to the whole audience.
Sorry,
I know you, of course.
Sorry, I'm Joseph Dungu. I head the Neglected Tropical Diseases Program at FIND. I was about to say that it's a very important question, and one which we have had to struggle with for the NTD program for quite some time. And it's mainly because quite often the priority that is given the highest score is what is needed then. We have had quite often very little resources or time to look at what would we need in the future if we are going to look at the futures approach. And so much as in the strategic plan that we have, we include the futures approach. When we get resourced, it's quite often the priorities that are needed then more than what would be needed in the future. I'll give an example of what we are doing now in schistosomiasis, where there are immediate needs now, but we know that as we move schistosomiasis towards elimination, there is a huge unmet diagnostic need there, tests that will be used in the future. So we have a portfolio in which we are looking at what is needed now and what will be needed in the future. And as I said at the beginning, quite often we find that resources are available for what is needed now. We are struggling with resources for what will be needed in the future.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Nick, there were a lot of questions to you about data. Could you do that rapidly?
Yes, I can do that rapidly. Well, first of all, most simply to answer the question about real versus nominal, this has all been adjusted for inflation. So it's all real figures in 2017 US dollars. So the changes that you see there don't reflect the effect of it just, increase of investment because of inflation. The second part of your question, could you just remind me?
Yes, it's whether the data is broken down by...
Yes, sorry, yes, that's correct. We don't do at the headline level a breakdown, above the diseases of diagnostics, therapeutics, vector control products, vaccines, but that is absolutely in the table for each disease, in the report, in the table for each disease, and it is available to do the breakdown at the high level, just per product, from our public search tool. So to answer one of the other questions, I guess, Alex, we are very keen to do that sort of analysis, looking at using the GFinder data, which is such a robust and rich source of data, to look at different models of development and how effective they are, and of investment and the impact of various incentive mechanisms. We are entirely project funded, so we need someone to fund us to do that. But I would highlight that all of the data behind the report is publicly available. Obviously, and this comes back to the question from Alex about the industry investment and the nature of some of that industry investment, we do aggregate all the industry investment to maintain anonymity, and which allows the industry to share data with us comfortably. So we were a little bit restricted in the way that we can, present that data freely. But I can absolutely say that yes, I think it would be wonderful if more companies, more of the large pharmaceutical companies were committed to investing in neglected disease R&D. But there is a really, really strong commitment among the majority of them. The fact that we do see less concentration of investment amongst the multinational pharma companies, we see change amongst who's the highest funder from year to year, and that we've seen the emergence of a significant investment from small and medium pharmaceutical companies, particularly in developing countries and particularly in India, has been really promising. And just to finally say that yes, Chagas is 100% in the report. It is just at the headline level, sort of grouped up into kinetoplastids. And Nathalie, I take your point that sometimes in grouping those diseases together, we reduce the visibility of those individual components.
So thank you very much to this panel, and thank you very much for coming. I've spared you my 10 minutes prepared initially opening remarks, now not happening closing remarks. Two things I do want to highlight, though. One is that I believe we do have to have a more systematic discussion with, and hopefully alliance building with, big players such as China, and that this is not so much a challenge to your work, but it's a challenge to us others that are here. And if an initiative of that nature could come out of this group in relation to the research, first of all, that is happening in China, and secondly, the availability, hopefully then, of data for your enterprise, and thirdly, the investment also in global groups and instruments and PDPs would be a significant movement. I think also in relation to what's going to happen the next 2 years, we already mentioned it, with all these big replenishment fundraising efforts that are going to be underway, it will be absolutely essential that this community does not get buried. And that again is a plea to all the agencies involved in this space. It's a plea to all the donors, and of course also within the donors there's different groups arguing for different sides. It's not always the same ministries that are funding, which in some countries can be very helpful, because in Germany, for example, it was a strong increase in the Ministry of Science and Research, so it did not directly affect what was happening in the development community. So spreading it out in donor countries, I believe, is also a very, very important way to be able to move that ahead. And therefore, if you get other ministries, rather than just development and health, interested in global health, who could be funding in this space, it can become very important. But thirdly, thirdly, I think it would be helpful, and I don't know if that's possible, whether then your next 2 or 3 reports, because of course they look at a different time, so it won't be the next report, it'll be the report after, that can actually relate developments to these big replenishment efforts. So, if also some reflection on that is possible as you prepare that GFinder report, I think that could be helpful for all of us in terms of what's happening in the larger global health community, and how our money's shifted around. And fourthly, I think it is really this thinking about, and we had some very, very good issues raised here around what the link into UHC means and how it can be expressed. It's happening, but it's not being expressed as well and described as well as it could be. and also with that futures perspective to indicate as products develop and change, what impact in turn they are going to have on delivery and health systems. So if we can also start to contribute to that discussion much more productively, then I think some things will be able to move forward. All of you have heard about the Global Health Action Plan, where now 11, if not 12 agencies are working together to address global health issues much more systematically under this title of Align, Accelerate and Account. And I think also, you know, this GFinder process is very much part of this and can help inform that effort. So thank you very much for launching it here at our institute. We feel very pleased and honored. We like to have lots of global health events here. Thank you to all of you for making the time and coming. Thank you for your hard work. And enjoy lunch, I guess. Thank you.
So keep an eye out.